The Fischer random match between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura continued today in Oslo. They played 4 games already, and Carlsen won game 4, so he has a narrow lead. And today they played games 5 and 6. I'm going to look at both those games, but in 2 separate videos, because both games were really unusual, very interesting, and I think, yeah, in their own way, quite unique. So game 5, first of all, Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces. As before, the players were shown the initial position, the starting position in the game, 15 minutes before play. So really they didn't have any time for any serious preparation. It's more just getting their heads around the position. And this is, compared to the first 4 games, somehow is a little bit more unusual, you know, with this knight in the corner. Of course, the bishops are the only pieces that are on the same squares as in classical chess. Carlsen opened with d4. So again, logical, classical principles, pawn in the middle of the board, and that frees this bishop. Nakamura followed suit, d5, didn't want to lose control of the centre. Knight b3, okay, bring this knight in the corner into the game, all seems very logical. And instead of following suit with knight b6, Nakamura struck out with e5. Now that introduces complications, because although you could say black has claimed more of the centre, of course this rook is now vulnerable to attack, so Carlsen gains time. And you can see he's already developed 3 minor pieces, and black is lagging a bit. But bishop b4, now it starts to get interesting. That's a pin. Obviously, knight can't move because of the rook is on prise. And here, Carlsen said after the game that he considered playing e4 here with a pawn sacrifice. And I have to say, this does look very tempting because white has a leading development. So black can take this pawn, but white has the 2 bishops. In particular, this bishop looks fantastic. You can see black's queen looks dreadful in this position. And now there's a funny trick which Carlsen pointed out. Knight c5, and if knight e6, a plausible enough move, then knight a6 is a rather embarrassing reply for black, at least. Trapping the queen, of course there's a pin. If pawn takes knight, then queen takes queen. So instead, well, Carlsen thought just bishop f5, and he said he couldn't really see what to do. But actually, I think white has pretty decent compensation here. For example, bishop b5, hitting the rook. So, you know, white's piece is coming out. Of course, c6 isn't possible because of the pin. So if the rook moves up, then queen b4 looks a bit awkward there. Or if knight c6, pawn to a4, so that if knight b6 you can push on again with a5. I think white has pretty decent compensation here. Its pieces look very active. In any case, Magnus chose not to do that and put his bishop back on d2. So a calm move, but not, I can't imagine that's really what he wanted to play, moving backwards. But now he struck out with e4, but it's not quite as forceful as on the previous turn, because black already has 1 more piece in play, that knight on b6 doing a good job. In any case, it's a pawn sacrifice, and Carlsen has this very nice bishop. And now queen d1, and this is a very interesting moment in the game. So you can see that without that dark squared bishop, this bishop, white's bishop here, looks like a really powerful piece. And Nakamura now played a move which Carlsen said he didn't even consider, and he said that that's the difference in styles between Hikaru and himself. Hikaru sometimes will play a move that looks positionally rather dubious if he thinks he can get away with it, whereas probably Carlsen just wouldn't even consider the move. Okay, why is this positionally dubious? Because it further opens up this diagonal. There's no chance of blocking that bishop later on with f6. It also opens this diagonal towards the king. So it's a very double-edged move. On the plus side, that's now potentially a powerful pawn duo. Not at the moment, but we'll see later on in the game. Queen d4. Well, you can see immediately how Carlsen is exploiting the weakness on that diagonal. Queen takes g7, mate threatened, knight e6, defends the pawn, hits the queen, queen comes to e5. And this looks like pretty decent compensation for white, because black's queen is just kind of bottled in the corner. I mean, this is a very unusual position indeed. Now, Nakamura castled. So that's, remember, this weird castling rules in Fischer random chess, that the king and rook always end up on the normal castling squares. And there's an interesting moment here, because Carlsen could actually castle queenside here. Let me show you this, just so you can get your head around the rules. So bishop to b5 hits the rook, and let's say bishop d7, and now it's possible for white to castle queenside. Okay, blink and you'll miss it. Watch this, castles queenside. So you always end up on the normal castling squares. It's not such a bad continuation, but, well, I think black still is a pawn up, and white's compensation probably isn't sufficient. But I just wanted to show you the possibility. Coming back to this position, instead Carlsen played knight to c5. And rook e7, of course, he's trying to get rid of that knight to get through to g7, but rook e7 defends. Now rook d1. And, I mean, black would have a pretty nice position here if it weren't for the queen. But, well, he's solid enough. The problem is that white also, well, this bishop, for example, can't come into the game, would like to come to c4, but the knight defends that square. So bishop e2, Carlsen looking to perhaps play out to h5, but Nakamura defends very well. Knight f8 hits the queen. I think it was very brave of him to go in for this at all, actually. And knight g6 hits the queen again. And here, I think Carlsen didn't play the best move. I think he underestimated Nakamura's chances. I think queen g5 is the best continuation here, and he does have some compensation in this position. Now the knight will come back into play, and you know, something like this, and well, not queen g6 and that pawn. This is always the dangerous pawn. This one comes forward. That looks good for black, but instead h4, and I think, you know, white is fighting in this position. But instead of that, Carlsen was obviously fixated on the idea of trying to keep black's queen out of play and somehow to tempt black into making more pawn weaknesses, and he played queen g3, which is an incredibly provocative move. I mean, one thing is he's trying to keep the queen bottled in, fine, but it provokes pawn to f4. So this pawn duo could be incredibly strong, or have they just further opened up black's position? So here's the game continuation. So Carlsen was obviously foreseen this position, and he's hoping that he can still generate some attack here. c6 played, so the queen starts to see daylight finally. Still not back in play. h4, and Carlsen still hoping he can generate enough play on the king side. But now f3, very strong move. Hikaru gets away with this by the skin of his teeth. He's just in time to set up a counterattack, because after this, pawn takes pawn, the knight comes in and suddenly black is absolutely fine. Indeed, white's king starts to look very strange here. So, I mean, this is a very odd position with this rook on h1. Really strange indeed. So, Carlsen is fighting for his life here. He's a pawn down, got two nice bishops, but the attack is fading. And, well, he's now offering the trade of queens here. If instead, let's say queen d2, then this knight would leap back into the game, and suddenly this attack is looking really vicious. That white's king is in desperate trouble here. So that's why Carlsen sought solace in the endgame with queen g3, but actually, well, let's see what happens. Knight a4. Now, what Carlsen did now was a mistake. He actually has such an unusual idea here, which I think, remember, this is a game with a fast time control, very hard to see this. But let's have a look anyway. Bishop b4. Pinning, so obviously that forces c5. Bishop comes back to a3. Now this looks kind of nonsensical. What's the bishop doing on a3? The problem is, black is actually finds himself in a bit of a gum here. So if the knight moves, then obviously bishop takes pawn, and that's tremendous. In the meantime, white is threatening to play b3 to drive the knight away. And if pawn to b6, then, well, let's castle. Don't forget, you can still play that move. Hitting the pawn, bishop defense, and now bishop b5 attacks the knight, and the knight has no squares. So after bishop a3, in fact, white should be okay here. I mean, I think black will also survive this position. So this defends this pawn, ready to move the knight, but bizarrely, white is okay here. So hitting that rook, and then you go back and hit this pawn. I mean, and that's actually a level position. I mean, that is so unusual. I mean, you're never ever going to find that in a rapid play game. But I just think it's a very unusual way to hold the position. Of course, this is a computer variation. My goodness. So bishop b4, incredibly, is a good move. But bishop d2 played by Carlsen, and now Nakamura starts to get going. So obviously, if knight takes pawn, then bishop b4, but instead king g8. But now that is a threat. So pawn came up, knight b2, hitting the bishop. Bishop here, and now Nakamura plays excellently. I mean, this knight looks like in such an odd position, but actually, this is an excellent maneuver. It's really strong. The point is that it's supporting the pawn. Well, we'll see. Carlsen castled, and bishop g4. So if rook takes knight, then f2 check wins the rook. And now, I mean, it's a very unusual position. After bishop d3, f2, you can see that black's pieces here just defend each other perfectly. So you can't get rid of the knight, can't get rid of the pawn, can't get rid of the bishop. And so they're locked together and basically just tying down white's king and rook, and bishops as well. So Carlsen cannot move a muscle here, and he's lost. So now all Nakamura needs to do is keep that bind and then slowly creep forward. So over these next moves, you can see that Carlsen is just making random hits, but actually going nowhere. And Nakamura just taking his time to creep forward, first of all gaining space on the queen side with his pawns. That's useful later for when he manages to break through. And now he brings the king up. And here Carlsen just gave away the exchange with bishop d6. If he keeps waiting, let's say bishop b5, something like this. Let's just have a very quick look to see how Nakamura would break through. So something like this. And g5, for example. I mean, there are going to be lots of ways to break through here. And, for example, here, and you can march the king in if you like. And rook h8, you know, you can finally get bishop h3 in. I mean, there are loads of ways. Just simply marching the queen up the board, the king up the board, is also very strong indeed. The game continuation. So Carlsen played instead bishop d6, but that just gave away the exchange. And now all Hikaru needs to do is just keep his head, keep his pawns, keep his head, attack this one, and just make sure you don't blunder anything, basically. And here, after a couple more moves, Carlsen resigned. Yeah, well, this rook is going to come in. Bishop d3 is happening. It's obviously completely lost. Well, Nakamura hits back, and so after 5 games he levelled the score in the match. But afterwards, Carlsen admitted, he said he thought that Nakamura played very well, and he said, of course, he wasn't thrilled about losing, but he said he wasn't so down because it was a very interesting game, and Hikaru did play very well. And I agree. I think Hikaru played very bravely, and in particular, this unexpected move, f5, rather anti-positional, but Hikaru proved that this was in fact a very strong move, and well, he got away with it. He took a risk and he got away with it. Okay, I'm going to go through game 6 in the next video, so do click over onto that if you want to see what happened next in this Fischer random match between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura.